Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by scholars who have received support from the Hagley Center in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds. Joining me today is Sam Schirvar, a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania and our recent Louis Galambos National Fellow in Business and Politics. Sam, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, you're so welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you're researching and writing about?
Yeah, so I'm researching how industrial development on Indian reservations since 1945 has reshaped relationships between indigenous nations and the federal government in the United States. So, just to give the audience some big picture background, the 20th century was a period of resurgence for indigenous nations and a growth of their political power. So, this began in the early 20th century with some legislation during the New Deal, which ended the practice of allotment of selling native land to private landholders and allowed tribal governments to reconstitute themselves under a framework delineated by the US government. But most famously, during the 1960s and 1970s, an era known as the era of native self-determination, um, uh, native politics once again gained a national stage. Indigenous cultures were seen as resurgent. Many white people had believed them to be completely extinguished, and they demonstrated themselves as present. And tribal governments in particular started taking on responsibilities from the federal government. So programs that had formerly been administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, programs in healthcare, education, social welfare, economic development were increasingly administered by tribal governments on reservations. So this transformation, known as native self-determination, has typically been studied as a change having to do with new policies, legislative change, new judicial reform, new judicial interpretations of constitutional law. It's also been studied as a cultural movement. It's been studied as a political movement of direct action and mobilization locally against settler violence. Many people are familiar with the American Indian movement, but it's less been studied as a period of economic change, and the business and enterprising aspects of tribal governments have been studied even less. So that's what my project is looking at, is how tribal governments became the principal economic authorities on reservations. And I'm particularly interested in them because one of the main distinctive things that they pursued was direct public investment. So tribal enterprises, many people today are familiar with tribal casinos, for example. Those didn't proliferate until the 1990s. But as earlier, much earlier, decades earlier in the 20th century, tribes began to set up tribally owned enterprises, which were in effect state-owned enterprises. And this is really surprising because the 70s, 80s, and 90s are a time that we typically think of as privatization, as the decline of public investment. And things look very different on reservations. Tribes are stepping up as public economic actors. They're creating publicly owned enterprises, and they're using this to provide employment opportunities and increase revenue for tribal government. So it's a really interesting, surprising story that shows us something new about Native history, but also U.S. history more broadly.
What an incredibly rich subject. I wonder what brought your attention to it in the first place.
Yeah, so I grew up in Minnesota, and that's a place where, I mean, I mentioned the American Indian movement. I grew up around Minneapolis, where the American Indian movement was founded. So it
Hmm.
is a place more than others, relatively, where Native politics are more present. And so that was something I was aware of at a younger age. Furthermore, another kind of important turning point in my thinking politically was I was part of a group in high school that was seeking to uh, there was a Ford plant that had closed in St. Paul, and this group was seeking to create a new some, create new job opportunities on that site by reintroducing manufacturing. And they were coming at it from this angle of social justice and environmentalism and seeing like introducing clean manufacturing as a political solution. And so that group, I mean, I've had lots of complicated thoughts about it since then. But those experiences had led me to wonder, question a lot of the kind of received assumptions about the relationship between native politics and economic development and the meaning of industrialization and industrial development politically on the ground for all different sorts of communities.
Mhm. So, what is the temporal frame for your study? I know you said sort of post 1945. Do you have a particular focus temporally?
Yeah, so the study begins with the first factory that ever moved to a reservation, which was an electrical equipment plant that moved from Chicago to a reservation in northern Wisconsin in 1946. And the tail end of the study is the 1990s, which were a period in which tribal governments basically shifted towards the gaming development strategy. So, like I said before, many people are familiar with tribal casinos. Those didn't proliferate until the 1990s. And so, actually, I'm looking at the decades prior in which the tribal enterprise strategy was created. And it was created surprisingly in the domain of manufacturing.
Was the tribal enterprise emphasis mainly on light manufacturing, like electrical components and devices?
Yeah, so there was all sorts of different things that were made in these factories. And as part of my research, I've created this large database of every single factory that located on the reservation. It's been really interesting to see what sort of trends I can find and what sort of things surprisingly don't seem to have trends. And so there's a whole diversity of things that were produced in these facilities. Everything from there was a frozen pizza factory, there were underwear factories. But there were two main themes that seemed to emerge from this. The most predominant types of facilities. The most predominant was natural resources processing. So this included things like refining energy resources like coal or oil, um, processing timber that was harvested from the reservation, processing canning salmon, for example, that was harvested from the reservation. And the second most common, surprisingly, was electronics assembly.
Hmm.
And this existed for a couple reasons. Electronics were physically lightweight products, and so they were relatively cheaper to transport across long distances and places in which the transportation infrastructure was sometimes poor. They were very labor intensive, so it didn't require moving a lot of capital and machinery to a new place. It was relatively easy to train a new set of workers who didn't have any of the skills in that type of work to do that type of work. But one of the most important reasons was that electronics have been in demand, high demand by the federal government, and especially the Department of Defense at this time. And so the federal government was giving preferred contracts to factories that were located on reservations in order to fuel that development strategy.
Mhm. Well, what's the relationship between these enterprises and tribal governance?
Yeah, so these enterprises were typically, uh, you know, private corporations, for-profit corporations, much like any other, whose sole stock owner was the tribal government itself.
Hmm.
So it is a form of public enterprise because it's a public entity, a tribal government that is the sole owner of this enterprise. So the enterprise is has management, it has a board, it has all these things, but it's sole stock owner, and so the people who are making the final decisions at the end of the day is the tribal government itself.
Hmm. And what about bringing economic and employment opportunity to reservations? I imagine you had mentioned that that is part of the strategy here. How successful? Maybe success might not be the right metric, but what was the impact made there?
Yeah, so I think like to help answer that question, it would help to give some background about the changing political meaning of industrialization on reservations.
Mm-hmm.
So when this begins in the 40s and 50s, that first factory that I mentioned, that was mostly done at the behest of the owner himself, who was trying to avoid unions in Chicago and seek a cheaper labor source in northern
Mhm.
Wisconsin. Um, and once the federal government realized that this was happening in the 1950s, they encouraged industrialization, actually with the end goal of terminating tribes and eliminating reservations, terminating tribes as political entities. So this is a period known by Native historians in the 1950s as the termination era, in which it was the policy of the federal government to move towards the elimination of tribes as political entities. And so the federal government believed that by increasing employment opportunities on reservations, they would uh, change the kind of economic situation. So rather than uh, basically, they were seeking to use wage income and replace what were treaty obligated payments to support tribal members on reservations. And so they saw industrialization as a way of basically turning Native people into typical U.S. Wage earners. And surprisingly, though, tribal leaders supported this because they saw it as advantageous since it countered and undermined the federal policy of relocation. So, as another way of trying to terminate reservations and terminate tribes, the federal government encouraged Native people to move to large metropolitan areas and seek employment there. And so, tribal leaders supported the industrialization of reservation because it brought those economic opportunities home so that people wouldn't have to move far away from their family's land and culture in order to seek employment opportunities. So while they weren't, super excited about factory development in for itself, they saw it as politically advantageous due to that political condition. So that leads to this big expansion of factory development in the 60s. So this is then the question of, what was the impact of that? Well, the way that that factory development was carried out in the 1960s was that the federal government would heavily subsidize private, non-native owned manufacturers to locate plants on reservations. They would subsidize wages, provide tax benefits, provide preferred contracts, all these different sorts of ways of trying to induce capital investment on reservations. And that worked for a period. That worked during the 1960s. Hundreds of factories were built on reservations across the United States. But in the late 1960s, early 1970s, as new investment opportunities opened overseas, it became more enticing for these private manufacturers whose, sole pursuit was profit to relocate their factories overseas. And it became less enticing, despite all the federal subsidies, to locate on reservations. So it's that at that period in which tribal governments themselves step up as becoming the economic investors. So when that strategy of industrializing with private capital fails, because that capital is seeking more profitable opportunities elsewhere, public entities, in this case tribal governments, step in and start to create their own enterprises, sometimes even buying up existing enterprises in order to maintain employment. And so I don't have a single answer on like what the overall economic impact of this in comparing it with, places in which there wasn't, comparing different outcomes and things like that. But I do know that like, had tribal governments not existed, many of these communities would have faced similar issues to other communities across the United States where large factories exist and then move away. The really surprising thing is that because tribal governments are able to step in as public economic actors, they're able to secure capital investment in place and provide a sort of stopgap against the type of capital flight that we see elsewhere.
What a complicated and fascinating story. It seems like it's just threads are being pulled in every direction. What a rich subject for your research. Now, you had mentioned that tribal governments being the main shareholders in these enterprises. So that's an interesting blend of public and private. Um, were they primarily seeking profit, or were they willing to operate, say, at a loss in order to fund the outcomes that they're seeking for their communities?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In the beginning, when tribal governments first kind of began to act in this more, you know, economically activist way, The goal was to maintain employment. So the benefit that they saw was, they had large amounts of capital through different ways, and they would invest that to try to maintain employments at high levels. And so they were willing to accept lower profits. These firms, because they're totally owned by the tribal governments, they're not, beholden to shareholders that are seeking, return on investment. Tribal government's goal is to maintain high employment because of all of the beneficial macroeconomic effects that has. So, in the earlier stages of this, like in the 1970s and 1980s, tribes are seeking for their enterprises to have high employment, even if profits are relatively low. And so that means that the benefits of the enterprises are more about the wage income that they provide to tribal members rather than the revenue that they provide the tribal governments. But as the strategy shifts towards gaming in the 1990s, their goal shifts to move from generating high amounts of employment to generating high amounts of profit. And that
Mhm.
profit is then brought into the tribal government. It's used as revenue to fund all sorts of, social services, hospitals, education, things like that. But it's definitely a different mode of, it's a different goal that they're seeking with their capital investment. But that's something that I'm still, just starting to understand with my research.
I'm wondering about the geographic or spatial aspect of this. Of course, native reservations are not evenly distributed around the country, but nevertheless, they do occupy a wide range of areas and different regions around the country. And so I'm wondering whether certain uh, tribal governments in certain regions were more or less invested in this development strategy.
Yeah, so most of the larger reservations are more located in the Western United States, and that is a story about, the colonial development of the United States itself, the removal of native peoples from the East towards the West under, genocidal programs such as Indian removal, famously known as the Trail of Tears. So many of the larger reservations are located in the West. However, the industrialization itself was happening all over the place. And something that I'd like to do in the future is try to specifically map out and see if I can see any sort of spatial patterns in where certain types of production are being located. But something that I have definitely noticed is that um, tribes are often promoting themselves to potential investors by saying, this reservation is located, relatively close to Oklahoma City, for example, and, growing cities in the West that are growing in the post-war period. Tribes kind of say, you may be building new markets in this area. Maybe you want to locate production here rather than shipping from the Northeast. And so they kind of take advantage of that. Of the growth of urban areas in the West to try to pitch themselves to investors.
Well, how are they making that promotional effort?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I've studied is the National Congress of American Indians, which is the largest native-led political organization in the U.S. Um, in the late 60s and early 70s, they held several industrial conferences that brought together um, private non-native capitalists and tribal leaders to try to encourage new sorts of investment opportunities. So these kind of looked like trade shows where tribal leaders would set up booths. Businessmen would be invited. I mean, and they were almost always men, of course, to kind of peruse the booths and then potentially make business relationships. So there were around 7 or 8 of these, I forget the exact number, between 1968 and 1972 that were hosted by the National Congress of American Indians. And they didn't have the outcome that they expected. As I mentioned before, this is that period in which private investment is increasingly pursuing opportunities overseas. But it's really, surprisingly, it's through this effort of the National Congress of American Indians, which we think of as a political organization, to build new economic relationships. Even though that they're not successful in creating a lot of new investment, they are training tribes. to run these programs themselves. So for tribes to be able to attract investment, they have to understand the language of industrial development. And that kind of inadvertently trains and prepares tribes to become economic actors themselves. So then that leads this transition in the 1970s, where rather than trying to seek private investment, tribal governments are beginning to act as the investors themselves.
Wow. I think this might be connected, but what are some of the materials that you dug into in your time at Hagley to help you uncover this research?
Yeah, so that's a really great segue off of that. So the main collections that I was looking at Hagley were the National Association of Manufacturers records. So this is, as many of the listeners might be familiar, the largest trade association of manufacturers in the United States. And many of these manufacturers were partners with tribal governments. So the people who ended up investing and building new factories on reservations were very often manufacturers who had close relationships with the federal government for reasons that I already mentioned about how the federal government offered preferred contracts to manufacturers that were located on reservations. And so many of those people were prominent members of the National Association of Manufacturers, familiar large manufacturers like General Electric, for example, or RCA, whose collections are also at Hagley. Um, so there is that, broader thing, and I can kind of get an idea of who these manufacturers were, what their broader political strategies were. But one of the really interesting things that I came across in my research was actually that the chairman of the National Association of Manufacturers in 1970 was William Wayne Keeler, who was then also the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And so this is something that hasn't really been noted even by historians of the National Association of Manufacturers. This Keeler was this really dynamic figure who held leadership roles not only in his own tribe, in Indian affairs more broadly, in the company that he worked for, Phillips Petroleum, a large Oklahoma oil company of which he was the chairman and CEO, and also, taking an activist role in the industrial world as the chairman of the National Association of Manufacturers. So looking at the NAM records allowed me to kind of understand the business perspective on all of these issues, but also helped me look at how William Wayne Keeler how he presented himself to this audience. So I've read his papers in the Cherokee Nation's tribal archives. I've read his papers in other sorts of government archives, but I hadn't been able to see how he presented himself to other industrialists. And this was a really interesting way to kind of complete, a picture of who he was as a person and what his motivations were and things like that.
He seems like a potentially really central character in your study.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say like if there is a main character, and I talk about lots of different people, it's certainly him because everywhere I look, he keeps popping up. I didn't even realize that he had been the chairman of the National Association of Manufacturers until I was in Hagley, and I'm like, what the heck? I didn't expect to see him here. But it certainly, makes sense with the kind of person he is.
Yeah, that's just wonderful. Now, I'm wondering how your Louis Galambos National Fellowship at Hagley impacted your professional development.
Yeah, so I mean, it's been really exciting to, I spent the past academic year at Hagley writing and was the, principal reason that I was there. And it was really fantastic to have such a great, space that is like secluded and absolutely beautiful grounds to work with such, supportive, generous people with a fully stocked library on business history there and the archives, just around the corner. So this, was a fantastic opportunity to just sort of, uh, you know, stew myself in all of the business history knowledge there and to work on writing and to kind of put these, elements together, indigenous history in the US and business history, which aren't often thought about similarly. And Hagley was a really great place to kind of grapple with that and bring those worlds together.
I do think not only does your project have intrinsic value and interest, but it's also really valuable because of that work you're doing of bringing business history into conversation with Native American history. And I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit upon that theme.
Yeah, so oof, I mean, there's a lot to go there. So like I said before, like, Native history is often studied as a political thing, as a cultural thing, less so as an economic thing. The economic aspects of Native history are not as often studied. There is a lot of really fantastic new work that's emerging. At the recent business history conference, there was a really great panel on Indigenous business history. So there's a lot of new, interesting research that's forming. But I think, it's when we want to reckon with what tribal governments are in our society today, who are these, there are many different things, and one of them is increasingly important regional economic actors who are uh, maintaining employment for many native people, but also many non-native people who are making investment decisions that are important in different local communities. We have to understand where that came from. And more importantly, we have to understand how that connects with their political goals. So tribal governments, of course, are not, you know, um, you know, even though they may act in many similar ways to municipal governments or county governments or state governments, they are the governments of indigenous nations. And so this, allows us to reconcile or allows us to kind of consider really the deep political meanings of business and capitalism and investment when we think about how indigenous nations have sought to control capital investment in order to further their own self-determination, their own political goals in a situation of, often extreme hostility and constraint, and how they've managed to survive through that.
Well, Sam, honestly, I can't wait to read your dissertation, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your work with us today. It's just been great.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.